Hi, my name is Morgan Lambrecht, and the topic I'm going to be talking about today is sleep. I think the topic of sleep is important because, especially at our age, a lack of sleep can lead to detrimental effects physically, mentally, and emotionally. For example, physically, if a person suffers from lack of sleep, their immune system may become weakened, and they can suffer from symptoms such as cold symptoms or other symptoms of their immune system being compromised. For example, if a person has had mononucleosis, also known as mono, in the past, the virus remains dormant in their body, and lack of sleep will cause a recurrence of this disease. Also, physical lack of sleep can lead to workplace injury or falling asleep at the wheel while driving. Emotionally, sleepiness affects a person's mood or mental status. People who suffer from severe lack of sleep may also suffer from mania. Our bodies need sleep to rebuild our energy and to mentally relax. Sleep is one of our body's coping mechanisms, and lack of sleep night after night can eventually catch up with a person, and their body will fight back. Some mental effects of lack of sleep were seen in the article I read this week. Students have a shorter attention span and difficulty concentrating due to lack of sleep, which may lead to lower grades or falling asleep during class. Students, though, are not the only people who suffer from lack of sleep. Those who work physically intensive jobs, such as operating heavy machinery, are at risk because if they fall asleep while operating those machineries, it can cause physical harm to their bodies. Also, people who work through the night shift, such as truck drivers or nurses, are also at risk of falling asleep during work. Recently, nurses have had to cut back their hours and only work 12-hour shifts because they don't want to put the patients at risk by having nurses work longer than 12 hours. So the article I read this week was called Delayed School Starting Time by 1 Hour, Some Effects on Attention Levels of Adolescents. And this article was published by the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine in 2011. In this article, researchers conducted a controlled experiment on a school in Israel, finding a correlation between sleep deprivation and students' attention spans during the day. If students are falling asleep or suffering from lack of sleep during the day, they'll have a difficulty time learning information and retaining that information. The researchers believe that by giving students an extra hour of sleep in the morning and starting class an hour later in the day, the students will be more attentive and attentive later on during the day. So this experiment was conducted in Israel, ages 13 to 19. The purpose of this experiment was to test whether or not sleep deprivation affected attention span and to determine if giving students an extra hour of sleep in the morning had a positive effect on their ability to concentrate. So to conduct this experiment, a test group and a control group were randomly assigned. The test group was allowed during the first week to sleep in an hour later and come into class an hour later, and then the second week they had to come in at the normally assigned starting time for the school. The control group had to arrive at the early time both weeks. Every day of these weeks, both the control group and the test group were given a basic comprehension test that they had to take. It was 100 questions, and they were scored based on their answers. Researchers found that when school started an hour later, the students performed better on the standardized test, proving that they had a longer attention span. So on these math tests, the answer was between 1 and 10, and they had to pick which one was the correct answer. So it was simple addition, subtraction, and multiplication. The author's conclusions, in the author's conclusions, the hypothesis that the students in the test group who were allowed to sleep longer would perform better than the control group was accepted. He found these results to be more valid because it was performed in a natural environment that students are in every day, so their environment was not changed, so that was not a factor or a variable in the experiment. He found that if the students had an extra 50 minutes of sleep each night for the 5 days that they're in school, they would have an additional 250 minutes of sleep per week. One thing I found in the article that I questioned, but he later talked about in his discussion, was if students were given an extra hour to sleep in the morning, would they compensate for that by going to bed an hour later? Um, in fact, this was out of this for him to find this. It was out of his range in the experiment, but he couldn't prove if the students were performing better due to sleeping an extra hour at the night during the night, or being able to sleep in an extra hour in the morning, but they actually did have a longer attention span. The author also discusses whether schools would implement this data and allow students to sleep in an extra hour in the night, but in consequence for this, they would have to stay in school an extra hour later at the end of the day because they still have to fit in their certain number of hours per week to be in school. So if students got out an extra hour later, this would push back their extracurricular activities, their homework. It might make them have to stay up later during the night. One thing I thought would be interesting was to see this same experiment done in different countries around the world, because I know, for example, in Europe, they have a 2-hour lunch break, whereas we here in America only have like a half an hour lunch break, and they have to go to school on Saturdays. So I'd be interested to see if that played an effect on sleep deprivation. So that was my topic on sleep. It was a very good article if anyone is interested in reading it. Thank you.